Thanks everybody for coming. I want to take a minute to introduce the head of our school, Jennifer Walsh, who's been a terrific intellectual lead for the school, as well as our administrator and fearless leader in all things strategic. So I want to introduce Jennifer and thank her for helping us put this on here.
Thanks, Christina. I want to welcome everybody to Worcester Hall and the college, and I also want to apologize for the fact that it rained yesterday. All of you folks from out of town probably thought, what a great thing to do. Come to California, it'll be gorgeous. You'll sit and watch the bay and see the Golden Gate Bridge. And it poured, I think, really, really hard yesterday, right? On top of everybody who was working out there on the shore. But, so thanks for putting up with that, and thanks for working really hard on what I can already see, and I already hear reports, is really fantastic work. It's so important for students, like the students in landscape architecture and environmental planning, to have this kind of opportunity to come together around a really significant issue and a really significant site, and have that interaction and have that learning and mentoring and intellectual exchange and exchange of design ideas and technologies happen. It's crucial to our educational mission. I'm hoping that the professionals also enjoy that process, and I know that the students come in to this program with incredible backgrounds and skills and talents and experiences, and then through these kinds of activities go out into the world, and they are skilled, they're talented, they're theoretically sophisticated, and they're really ambitious about wanting to make change. And that's, I think, one of the hallmarks of Berkeley, of College of Environmental Design, and this is really the epitome of the kinds of things that we like to see happen and like to see professionals and students come together with faculty to do. I'd also like to just acknowledge Christina. Christina, yeah. Christina just arrived last summer and has just like a lightning bolt or a thunder dome or something. But the amount of energy, insight, and intellectual fervor that she is sharing with students and with me, I have the pleasure of playing a minor part in one of her classes this semester. It's just been great. She's just really transforming the department and in really positive ways. So I want to just say thank you, and I just want to say again, we're really glad that you're here at Berkeley.
Thanks.
So,
thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I want to say briefly who I have invited, who's here. I'm really glad that they are here at Berkeley this afternoon, and then Barbara Dykes from the Landscape Architecture Foundation will introduce her guests. First, I want to thank Brad McCrae from the Bay Area Conservation and Development Commission, who is the Director of Regulatory Programs for BCDC, and a real supporter of the College of Environmental Design, and someone who we're all glad to have as a leader in the Bay Area. So thank you, Brad. And then Julie Beagle is here from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. She's a research scientist at SFEI, and somebody who I've seen here on reviews do an excellent job helping students understand what the issues are, and I thought it'd be great to invite her back also to help us get a better sense of what we could do around the Bay Edge. And John Roberts, who's one of the leading environmental planners in the region, and someone who's on our faculty here. We're very lucky to have as an adjunct faculty member. John knows a lot about the Berkeley Pier and Marina site, and we're very happy to have him join us today as well. And then Catherine Boyer, I can't see her, she's. Dr. Boyer is at San Francisco State University, and she is one of the people leading habitat restoration efforts and the reinsertion of subtidal habitat as well as wetlands in the Bay Area. So she really knows what is and isn't working, having been out there in the waders, putting all those plants in, and then tracking them. And then Liz Excel, is she here? Liz, hey, great, we haven't met yet, but we've corresponded by email. Liz is a program associate at the Bay Institute and has just run a town hall on Tuesday, or Monday or Tuesday, this past week, Tuesday, on the idea of horizontal levees and the Bay Institute's effort to try to lead a conversation about sea level rise adaptation that also creates a better living shoreline around the bay. I think that's my guess. I don't see Linda Jewell yet. Am I just missing her? No, she may come in a little bit later. Barbara, would you like to introduce her?
Delighted to introduce two guests here today. We have Chris Diamond, who's the Chief Operating Officer for PWP and is a past president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation and responsible for also hiring me, so thank you very much. I love my job, the greatest job. And I'd also like to introduce and recognize Jacinta McCann, who's the Executive Vice President for AECOM and our President-elect for the Landscape Architecture Foundation. So thanks for all your leadership to create and develop and support such programs in partnership with Landscape Forums. Thank you very much for all your support for this great opportunity. I remember as a student participating in a charrette, and it was so influential to me because I met people who I'm still working with today, and it's just nice to have your other soulmates and leaders in the profession out there in different capacities working together to create change. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.
All right. My name is Kevin Conger from CMG Landscape Architects in San Francisco.
Brian Yenchek from Hargraves Associates, San Francisco.
And we would like to thank the amazing students and young professionals that came together to pull this off. It was originally set up in a format where there would be two teams divided. Each team would sort of pursue a scheme and end up in kind of a smackdown at the end. And what we thought would be more productive would be to mix it up and have everybody all collaborate on the same efforts. And so we did that. What you're going to find is a bunch of research that was done collaboratively with the entire group. And then some design proposals were identified by the entire group, and those were refined by the entire group working all together. And it was a very, very productive and collaborative effort, most productive, especially when Brian and I got out of the way. And it's come together really, really well. So that's been great, and we're really happy to be here. This project deals with sea level rise. Sea level rise is imminent, and it's urgent, and we need to find some solutions. And nothing is really happening substantially to address it, and doing nothing is not going to cut it. The existing bay edge, in our opinion, is not good enough anyway. There's many areas that don't have a high enough ecological value, that don't have a high enough cultural value, and don't necessarily capitalize on their strongest assets. And we think that all of that can change and that there's an opportunity in there. So we propose that now is the time to rise up and deal with this. We need to articulate a new vision for the Bay Edge. We need to discover these opportunities to do better with ecology, do better with the cultural connections to the Bay Area, do better for the economy, and to make great places around the Bay that the Bay Area community falls in love with.
To put it another way, sea level rise could quite honestly be the best thing that's ever happened to us, we found. So Rise Up, our charette's title, is a positive look at sea level rise. What are the opportunities that sea level rise is going to bring to us? What challenges will those introduce? And how can we harness all that to, as Kevin mentioned, really just improve our edge? Recreate a San Francisco Bay Edge that improves human services, ecological value, deals with rising tides, stormwater, and does all that in a very beautiful way. We want to create compelling landscapes at the edge that draw us back down to our edge. We stop going there because it's simply parking lots or restaurants. What can we do hand in hand with sea level rise to really grab onto this rare opportunity that we have? It's going to instigate us. Now's the time. So what we found was, so the Berkeley Pier Complex is our site, but what we found that was interesting was that it was quite prototypical both as a site as well as the solutions to many other sites throughout the Bay. It becomes this petri dish, this testing bed for ideas that we could deploy elsewhere. The site has within it landfills that we have to deal with, that we have to protect, or at least that's the position we took for the charrette. We also have other cultural artifacts like an amazing pier that we may or may not choose to protect. Other piers will have, to our north, a horse racing track. To our south, we have people that live on the Emeryville Pier. We're going to find that in every one of these outcrops of land, there are things that, decisions and choices that we have to make about what we protect, what we don't, and where do we manage change. So that will ultimately create, as you'll see, a couple of frameworks that look at how we manage that choice, and then tactics for then how we deploy increasing ecological value and human use. And we do all that, as Kevin reminded me moments ago, to create beauty, to create that compelling image that brings us back down to the edge once more. You know, these renderings here that are behind us, some of these are just simply photos that we drew inspiration from, but a lot of these are actually renderings made in an hour ago that show some of the opportunities for passive strategies. You know, what about camping? What about camping on our bay edge, recreation? What can we do to actually maybe amplify some of the infrastructure that we choose to hold on to? We have so much water that's creating a new landscape for us. How can we amplify that? Never did we think about it in the charrette that we're losing land. We're not. That land is simply transforming from one state to another. And how can we leverage that? How can we rise up to this challenge?
So Andrew and Lauren are going to be our co-MCs and take us around the room and keep us on track. You guys want to?
So we're going to start.
We're
going to start with Christina.
Okay, then I'll hand it over to Andrew. I am starting because we prepared some materials for the group ahead of time about the ecology of the bay and the history of the pier and the ecology of the bay. And what I wanted to emphasize is always kind of a game of telephone, trying to communicate some ecological priorities and then also get that into design, and pieces are left and emphasized differently along the way. But what I tried to emphasize and what I have learned from others, reading the materials of the San Francisco Estuary Institute or the Bay Institute or talking to Catherine Boyer, I'm sure I have mistranslated some of this, but what I understand is that it would be helpful to have more intertidal habitat because we're going to be squeezing all of that wetland habitat as sea levels rise and as development continues to push towards the shoreline. And I also understand that the joint assemblage of habitat in the subtidal, the intertidal, and the supratidal makes the whole thing work better, rather than just shooting to have one thing, one piece of this whole kind of eco-ramp that goes from the very bottom subtidal to the above tidal zone. I also think that from an ecological perspective, around the bay there are places where we should find a way to design the exclusion of humans in some areas, and there are places where we should find a way to design the active access for humans to understanding what's going on. And we won't have our most unusual species in places where we're designing the most access for humans, because they'll come with dogs, there'll be kids playing in the water, it'll be muddier, things will happen. And I don't believe you just build it and they will come. There's a lot of stuff happening that prevents some unusual species from coming. But I think that what we could do is, as our shoreline is changing, take that very dumb riprap edge and do something much more alive with it. And I really appreciated what the Bay Institute is trying to convince us of with their horizontal levee idea, because that's something that could be combined with other artificial structures. A horizontal levee would be an artificial structure. The pier is an artificial structure. How do we take all those artificial structures and identify their benefits? Instead of saying, human structure is bad, native habitat good. How do we combine them into a hybrid that might have more emphasis towards human cultural use in some areas and more emphasis towards human exclusion in other areas, and making that exclusion beautiful as well? So that's what I challenged them to think about, basically, was the intertidal and how they could do that as part of an assemblage, recognizing some of the potential benefits of the artificial structures that are there and that may be there. I also tried to emphasize the idea of reversible experiments. I think we need to follow what the Europeans and the Asians are doing by trying small things that we can monitor in an intellectually honest and rigorous way and learn from, so that we can take out the ones that don't work and replace them with things that do over the next 25 to 50 years and longer, because of course our dynamics, our sea level rise dynamics will go on much longer. So thank you all for coming and listening to me talk about that. I'm going to turn it over now to the professionals who are here to do their story of how they responded to what I seeded in that conversation.
Thank you. Well, first to start off, we would like to thank Christina, our host, Landscape Forums, the student body group, and all of the everybody that's joined us here today to go along on this journey with us. It's been inspiring, enriching, and we could keep going on and on. I'm Andrew Elmer. I'm from Populous Architecture, based in Kansas City.
And I'm Lauren Hackney from PWP here in Berkeley. And just to build on what you just said, we'd also like to thank Kevin and Ryan for being just amazing leaders. We really enjoyed this process.
So to start out, I would just like to set out the framework for the presentation. We're going to start with analysis. So we'll look at the bay, we'll look at ecology. Eventually we'll work up in scale to the site, and we'll analyze the site and edge conditions, moving towards what if we do nothing? What if we leave this site and we let it become what it will? What does that mean with the rising sea levels? Ultimately, working around to our frameworks, and we will also see how our tactics that we've developed and how those activate both frameworks, how they apply to these sites as well as potential other sites around the Bay Area.
And for the frameworks, we really tried to create a spectrum. So we tried to push it to either end of the spectrum. So hopefully we can have a really good discussion about maybe how the best strategies are something in between.
So please join us on this journey where we'll migrate around the room, and we'll start here with Bay ecology.
We want our guests especially to be able to have front row seats, so we can make some space in the front for our guests.
So, all the way to your right, we just have a map that sort of highlights the different types of edges around the bay. Beach edge, a marsh wetland edge, areas with riprap and mudflats, and an urban edge, of course. And just to go over basically how we looked at ecology, integrating it into our framework really briefly, is that we basically looked at the existing ecology and we recognized what we could and couldn't do within the scope of our project. And we identified opportunities to enhance existing ecologies and create new ones, especially in that intertidal zone that Christina talked about. And then we took these opportunities into consideration in thinking about what we wanted to propose, and especially new typologies for our edges. So within that,
Yeah, let's move on towards history of the place, history of the pier. Eric?
Sorry. So I have a hard time remembering that I did do this.
You can't possibly hide.
Thanks. So the history of the Berkeley Pier, very briefly. I was told I have 1 minute. It has it's seen a variety of uses, and I think we can kind of classify them based on the infrastructural agency that they were serving. So we originally had a wharf structure that was used for shipping in the 1850s with an existing shoreline that was set back in near the offices of PWP on what? Like I think 4th Street was the original coast. Anyways, yeah. So there was a pier that came out, and it was replaced over time. In 1909, the Berkeley Wharf was put in, and that was the public transit pier that was bringing the birth of the public transit age to the citizenry of Berkeley. And likewise, as the auto boom got a hold in the 20s, it was replaced and became an auto ferry. And that's what we see the armature that is the vestige of today. So that was closed in 1940 after the Bay Bridge was opened. It kind of proceeded to see an interesting and well, is it interesting? I don't know, just a long decline, which was punctuated by 2 fires, one in 1961 and maybe in the 90s it seems like there was another fire that burned off there was kind of an observation deck. So it's a pier in decline, and there's certainly structural needs. It's a concrete structure, it's an 8-on-10 grid of pilings, and if you go out there today, you can see that surface is rather mottled and seems to be in need of some degree of repair. So 1 minute, history instruction.
So we'd like for everyone to join us over here, and we actually basically have enough room for people to stand, so we're hoping it'll just be an informal presentation and move around.
here.
We're going to start right here, so we're going to work counterclockwise. Okay, so now Ellen is going to discuss uses, historic uses, current uses, and what we've identified as potential program elements being future uses.
Right. Moving on from looking at the history, we started to focus in more on what the uses are, what they used to be, what they are now, and like Andrew said, moving on, looking towards the future. Building off of what Eric's already said, y'all are familiar with the historic uses. Another big driving factor of the history was obviously the landfill, and those are still present today and the big items to deal with. The existing uses, what we have out there today, are a little more widespread, a little more spread out. So we've got office buildings, restaurants, fishing, kayaking, multiple water recreation. I don't want to bore y'all with the list, but when we move on looking at our future and proposed uses, we didn't want to just throw out uses because they sound good. We want to essentially create a sense of place. So we saw that with this kind of simple Venn diagram. We have the place, which is our site. We have the proximity, which is the bay. And then we have our purpose. Why are you going to the site? And all those need to overlap into something that makes sense. So whatever overlaps in that middle area, those uses are what sound good for the site. So moving on, we moved to what we call a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are opportunities and what are our threats? We have obviously a lot of text up here, but some highlights would be, our biggest strength, we're on the water. People want access to the water. Weaknesses, the landfill. Maybe that is a weakness, maybe that's a strength. It's kind of how you see it. The landfill we need to address and protect. Another weakness that we saw, you don't have a lot of public gathering, shelter. We experienced that in the rain for sure. And our opportunities, we tried to organize those under these guidelines that kind of follow through the rest of the design and proposal. The environment and ecology, economic viability, recreational aspect, addressing infrastructure, and maintaining the great culture you have out there and also enhancing it.
You'll see how these guidelines are applicable towards both framework plans as well as the assortment of tactics, which we've gathered on the back of this board, and we'll be able to talk to those as we move throughout the presentation. Moving on to bay edges, Aaron and Joe.
So we took a little time to try and understand how the site fit into the bay in general, and did this rough diagram of where the different edge conditions existed, and tried to get a handle on sort of their distribution and the quantity. So we found that about 40% was structure of some kind, an urban edge, 20% was also mud flat, there was 23% sort of riprap, also a rather hard edge, only a little bit of sand, 2%, and then more soft edge of wetlands. And we came away with sort of a broader picture of the center of the East Bay being armored with sort of these soft edges that we move forward into the rest of our thought process.
Yeah, this was really important for us to kind of consider how our tactics are prototypical and where else they might be applied on the bay.
Yeah, so as we know, sea level rise is imminent here, but these pictures you'll see around how we essentially built the site and then flooded the site. So some of the existing conditions we talked about, these are sections of those. And we went into what that condition looks like, kind of going a gradient from hard to soft, essentially low diversity to more diversity. And then showing this red line. There's a plus 13 to 14.5, which is kind of the anticipated 2100 level sea rise. We're going above that even further because of the way that we know sea level rise has gone and what population is going to do to that in the future. So we're anticipating a plus 18 above that. So that's what these conditions are kind of showing, and that's what our framework plans will be designed into.
Yeah, so as Kevin and Brian mentioned earlier, sea rise is imminent. We're going to have to either respond to it or adapt to it or a multiple other options. So that said, if we're going to rise up to meet the challenge, we need to address the guiding principles in order to drive that development. And that said, let's move into our base scenario where we effectively do nothing.
Before that, we can just look at the site analysis really quickly, just so you get a spatial understanding of where the landfills are. We all know this is the pier, the marina, and these two boxes represent the capped landfill that's there. And based on that information and the information that we have here that models these new higher projections of sea level rise that we've established, we're charged with the task of determining what may happen in the worst case scenario in 2100 if we don't do anything. Some of the things that we think will happen is that the marina will be exposed to sediment, corrosion of the edges. The landfill will be completely submerged and compromised, potentially leak into the site, which could make the whole area quite dangerous for species and humans. Some of these land masses are going to break off into islands. We'll have some structures that may be floating around. We'll lose access to a lot of these sites. We'll lose all of our program. We'll have little reason to really go there. And it'll disrupt, as we can imagine, the sort of fragile system and chain of our species on the site. And from that, we made a kind of a assumption that over time, ecology value may begin to decrease, but potentially over time could increase. The cultural values will most likely decrease as the site will not be accessible. And from that, we tried to come up with a way to move forward and a way to establish our frameworks. And we did that by establishing what our assumptions are that became pretty clear from the worst case scenario picture and from the rest of our analysis. And the first one, which has been repeated a million times, is that sea level is imminent, and this is kind of what it looks like again on our site. That we need to be more intertidal area, that we have to address the issue of the landfills, and that there's some value, cultural value to this pier that we should figure out. And these are sites specific to this area, but they can also be applied, as mentioned, around the Bay Area. So, as Brian mentioned, what's a pier here may be the racetrack up to the north, and so on. And from there, we really wanted to investigate two polar framework, and really for discussion and how we may decide on some sort of combination or some middle ground. So I think the purpose for what work we've done from here on out is really set a framework for discussion to have with all of y'all who have these sort of expertise to guide us.
We're talking about what's on the polar.
Sure. This is talking about these two schemes that I just mentioned. And we see them on a scale of investment, both in energy and money and risk. So on one end, we'll see high investment, high infrastructure, high risk, and on the other, sort of low interest risk investment.
So since said, we split off from here into two basic groups. One was looking at frameworks. How do we use this site specifically to explore the ideas that could have potential in other locations around the bay? In those two frameworks, took two general extremes or positions. One was basically, let's see what we can do with what's here. Let's do the minimal amount and see if we can do something good with that. Because the reality of sites like this and a lot of other locations, there's not going to be a lot of money. There's not going to be a lot of opportunities for major investment. What can we do with the kind of most bare bones use of what's already there and use that as an example for moving forward. The other extreme is, let's say that this is a really great opportunity to do a lot of development. We're going to do a lot of construction. We're going to add a lot here. And both of those frameworks then said, well, if we're going to take strategies in those two positions, how do we start to use things like the edges of the site, existing structures like the piers, to build pieces, test parts, and those are that whole series of kit of parts over there that explore those opportunities. So there's things that we know we have to do, like I said, taking the landfills into consideration. There's things that we want to do, like holding on to the piers. And all of the sites across the bay are going to have opportunities and requirements like that.
So we'll start with the kind of lower end of the spectrum that Haley talked about. This strategy basically asks, what do you let go and what do you keep? What's important? So in exploring this, we identified what is the risk. So the landfills are obviously a risk. What are the assets? The pier. And obviously the projection out into the bay, which is really rare. And potential exchanges. So what are some material exchanges on the site that could reveal processes of the larger bay area and also make the site kind of work a little better in terms of access, especially to West Berkeley, which is a burgeoning neighborhood. So we're trying to use localized operations that basically make liabilities into opportunities. So I'll run through, we have a quick sequence of plans. So basically the first kind of action is to remove the riprap and take away the shield from certain locations on the site and use that to build up the edge of Cesar Chavez in a way that basically allows access down to the water. So not necessarily just a dumb riprap edge, but one that is terraced and allows for different textures. So in doing that, you build up this edge, which responds to the kind of hardest wave action from the bay, and then taking dredge from the dirt pile and bringing it over here to start to grade up a wetland. The next action, as this area floods, is to let the marina go and to basically let this fill go and kind of become a sand engine that will replenish this side. And in doing that, also grading up a levee around to protect the meadow right now, which is also a landfill. So you end up with this kind of dialogue of the mound of Cesar Chavez and the bowl of the meadow, which allows for a lot of programmatic opportunities that aren't currently there. So this is the kind of the final diagram that we envisioned, where there's this series of blended edges that really increase intertidal habitat and really amplify what's there, amplify the experience of the pier and amplify the experience of these two areas and really turn them into special spaces. In terms of the experience of the site, we have a couple of perspectives that explain this area. So this is looking back toward Berkeley. So we've talked about possible campground, maybe some informal shows in this bowl space, which can act like an amphitheater. And then using the pier, basically building on top of the existing pier and keeping those current piles as habitat, important habitat, but basically building a floating pier on top of that, which maintains the access out to the water. We looked at a few precedents locally, the Sutra baths, Beth Gali's baths in Barcelona, and in a more ephemeral sense, wondering what you can do to harness fog and be really simple about tactics that kind of key into the bay processes. So maybe on the pier there are lights that engage the fog that talk about a watermark and sea level rise in the process. So I'm going to ask Johanna to talk quickly about the sections that we did of this.
Just to locate the sections, we have one running here through what's now Cesar Chavez, the upper landfill, and another one running here through the lower landfill. With the upper landfill, you can see again this terrace that Lauren's talking about in terms of fortifying that edge, but making it still accessible for people to get down to the water. Over on the eastern side, we're talking about moving the fill in to allow for wetland succession over time. So that would be that softer, more dynamic form of support and protection. Again, a little blow up of what that would look like over on the west side, and a little blow up of what that would look like over on the east side. And for section B, again, this is really about moving the dirt in and creating and grading for wetland succession over time on this northern side, which is this blow up right here. And on the southern side, it's making that levee where you can also put a road on top to maintain access to the floating piers that were talked about a little bit earlier. So again, a blow up over on the north side and a little blow up on the southern side.
And I'll throw it over to Valerie quickly. The three tactics that we thought were prototypes that we used on the site are the wetland edge, so this area here, the horizontal levee to protect this, And also we were considering the terraced riprap as kind of a horizontal levee at the raised pier. So if she could just talk quickly about
Tactics are located over here. It's also what we're terming the kit of parts, which we see are potential ideas which are viable to solve these various issues around the entire bay.
So to understand how these frameworks are working at a smaller scale and kind of looking at the ideas that were brought apart through our charrette process, we took the opportunity categories that were mentioned earlier and we used them as our categories for kit of parts. So we're looking at, how do we start improving the environment and the ecology of the area? What kind of economic drives can we put in the site to bring revenue and help support the area? What are the recreational opportunities that bring people to the site? What's the infrastructure that moves the people through the site? And what's the cultural aspect that keeps memories and the history of the area and brings the culture surrounding the area to the place? And these components, these tactics that we've come up with aren't necessarily just for these two frameworks that we've created. We realize that the entire Bay Area may be an issue down the road, or certain parts are. We understand that these components can also be applied not only to our site, to other parts of the bay, but also nationwide, worldwide, where these issues of flooding and sea level rise may occur. We've got a couple other individuals that will talk about some of the components that address what Lauren was talking about in her framework, and as well as others that are in the second framework.
So if we want to go through the first category, like Heather said, we organized these by our 5 core opportunities, and the first is environmental and ecology, where one of the main things we focused on was building habitat for fish, animals on land. And I'll focus on one of these opportunities we saw was adding gabions to the existing pier columns or a new pier or any structure you're putting out in the water. That is one way of creating more surface area for mussels to attach, and that in turn draws in fish and creates more diverse life. So we're going to go on to economic.
So the next, I think what we want to do is we'll bring it back over here and we're going to explore the HARD scheme, where we're being more aggressive with infrastructure and addressing the issues at hand. And then we will go back to the HARD scheme.
So our team took a completely different approach. Our project's name is Pierscape, but late last night it affectionately became known as Hard and Dangerous. You'll learn actually through our design that hard doesn't mean dangerous, and it also doesn't mean you can't have new communities, new ecologies, and new places for recreation. A lot of our inspiration came from an aquatic specialist named Captain Kirk yesterday, and despite the fact that there are no people on the pier, he assured us that it's lively and there's people there 24/7. Fishing, and that the pier and the hardscape actually creates a great aquatic habitat, and it's a cultural and historical significant piece of infrastructure. So with that, we came to our thesis that the pier is a historic spine for development and infrastructure. Hanging off this spine are the wharf districts. So this is just a quick partie showing the pier, and then these wharf districts. And the districts could be anything from the landfills, from floating wetlands, to a new terrestrial park. And this concept continues to use the pier and surrounding districts to address the sea level rise. So some quick diagrams explaining this. These are the 2 areas that need to be preserved, as we've talked about earlier. The landfills can't be inundated. Taking those 2 places, we started to program them. We have a new terrestrial park, terrestrial zone, and then we looked at actually urbanizing this area, creating new homes, a new community, and that becomes the yin and the yang. And because our project is going to be slightly more expensive, we thought this is kind of the economic catalyst for this area. We then looked at soft and harder edges as well. So we have terraced edges across here, and then we have the harder ones protecting the fronts, as we mentioned. And then finally, looking at how access is going to be happening across our site. So we still have this main vehicular access, which then turns into pedestrian. Boat access through our modules, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The marina stays, and then you actually have this new pedestrian line that continues around the entire site. Christian will speak a little bit more to the program.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little overview of the plan and some of the elements that are occurring in Pierscape, and I'll kind of do it through the lens of an additional list of tasks that Christina gave us about when we were, things we were tasked to look at when looking at this site, and that was revealing these ecosystems, creating more access and paths, looking at the fishing opportunities in that industry, looking at revealing the history of the pier, and improving intertidal habitat, which has been mentioned a couple times before. So with revealing ecosystems, you'll notice that, just to take a quick step back, we're looking at, through all these in a much more structural, sculptural, architectural approach to look at what are the ways that we can address this in a much with hardscape versus softscape, and are those viable or are those not. So with revealing ecosystems, we're looking at elements like filtration systems at the outflow of Strawberry Creek and additional creeks nearby that have a sculptural element that reveal the fact that the creek is outflowing there, and dealing with and finding ways to attempt to filter the water. We're looking through this urban form, we're looking at how that urban form interacts with the water and enables people to, that is part of the neighborhood, that is part of the district, and the process of remediation of the site is part of that experience. Some of the sort of more finer-grained modular elements at this end of the pier, which are going to be talked about in more detail by some of the students, are sort of fun elements. They're about interacting with different systems, whether they be shellfish industry, wetlands, just total recreational elements, floating platforms to hang out on. And we're also looking at sort of the idea of seafood to supper, the idea of taking restaurants that are on the site and creating even more of a district of sort of seafood and harvesting and industry interacting in the same space. Some of the things we're looking at with paths are using the urban grid of the new development to create more access across that area of the site. We're looking at really strengthening and preserving this alignment that the pier creates. Kind of an alignment when we're standing out there, it's like it directs you right out to infinity. So we wanted to really preserve that sort of line as a major move. And we wanted to create a lot of flexible circulation within this sort of modular pier structure, which we'll see in more detail. That's sort of that second perspective drawing right there. As far as fishing, again, I mentioned that we're looking to create more diverse shoreline, but how can that be done with more hardscape sculptural elements? We're looking at how these fishermen can be more engaged in producing food for restaurants in that area, foragers, not just people with the fishing lines. As far as revealing the history of the pier, we kind of took the opposite approach, and rather than sort of talking about, we might maintain some of the historical elements, but we want to really emphasize this pier is occurring in the present and it's part of the future. It's not a relic. And I think I'll just leave that as it is. And intertidal structures, we're looking at how can these pilings create more intertidal habitat? How can this harder sculptured edges create more intertidal habitat? What will that do? And how can we address sort of these softer, more intertidal areas with harder sculptural elements that sort of call attention to them? So that's sort of our bigger picture framework, and I think we're ready to kind of move into tactics again.
Yeah, if we could just briefly go into tactics so we have enough time for discussion. That'd be great.
Yeah, we have a couple tactics over here too, so we'll probably be a little whiplash sometimes.
So we've got a couple individuals that just talk about one or two per category and kind of understand how these components start to relate to the overall framework sites that are plans that you see on the wall and the other adjacent.
Okay, well, we wanted to develop an idea of culture at the park, and we came up with some ideas that I think could be more site-specific or just overall. One idea that we had was to engage people in the issues at hand at the park was to create islands of wetlands that floated, and they float and then they're planned to submerge. And it's kind of hand in hand a positive thing, because as they submerge, they help create more intertidal, in a more intertidal environment, which creates more habitat. But then as they float, they also have large numbers attached to them, or some sort of symbol that could be attached to signage that could help people understand what's going on. And they could watch the islands grow and change over time, and learn really the process that's happening and how it helps the environment there. So that was one of our main ideas for how to engage the people in the park.
Another more awareness type of installation is not land art, but rather landfill art.
with so much fill around the bay. It's this idea of having people understand what they're actually walking on, because we've landscaped a lot of these formations. This design's by Nate Kaufman, who couldn't be here today, but it's essentially a core sample of what's below you, maybe 10 feet, 12 feet, 20 feet sometimes, these landfills below us, bringing this up, lighting it from below to create a dynamic educational experience.
Moving into our infrastructure category, and just to mention, as you've noticed, a lot of these tactics actually covered many of these, but we've sort of grouped them as you see. Infrastructure, looking at the pier that we're activating in both proposals, just different alternatives to what we could do with that pier, whether keeping it like that, having it floating, allowing people to be closer to the surface of the water, different strategies for that. Looking, the same old ideas that have been incorporated in infrastructure, but how that might work in any of these proposals and beyond. So we've got our seawall. We've got, this is kind of a combination where we have receding terraces, kind of in, which creates a locking system, but the water's going into the area. Really embracing the horizontal levees and kind of teasing out several different iterations of what that might look like. Whereas here we have the baseline water level and then adding an additional 6 to 9 feet of periodic influence, both king tides, El Nino and all that packaged together, plus another 8 feet of where it might be going in the future. And so looking at where that might go. And this, we call it the cerebellum type. It's actually, it looks like terraces in a section, but it's actually one long ramp. How that plays into the protecting boundaries, whether it's a landfill or something else that we're trying to keep out of the water. But then looking at more other strategies that are basically using the same idea of gradually sloping with a riprap. These ones maybe are more specific to...
Right. So our group was involved with treating the edge condition between the park and the water. We feel like it's a very important part because right now we feel like the whole place is really lacking interaction between the public and the water. So going along with the theme of being hard and dangerous, but we try to go to play for this time because danger seems to, well, it could be both, I guess. But basically we came up with different themes. One is the theme of having the pylons, going up and down. It's kind of the language that we have there in place right now. We have these pylons everywhere. Then we have this theme of pools, borrowing some of the language from the floating planters that we hear in a minute. Sort of like the concept of having these pools in a square format going up and down, so you have these intertidal zones. And then ramps, slides, think about the sloping lawns. Still being a sloping lawn would be a sloping cement going to the water. And these can vary in different gradients. Some of them can go all the way from 35% to maybe 10%, and some of them can be 0%. So you can have this sort of, thing jetting out into the water. It could be a climbing wall or a diving platform into the bay. And then you have another scheme. We have these slabs going into the water. So you can do this 1,000 different ways. We just wanted to give you a flavor of what can be done at the intersection between the land and the water.
We also thought about the recreational potentials of the site, especially if we're putting so much effort into restoring this bay ecology or even creating a new one. So playing off the success of the recreation facilities on Angel Island, we were thinking about floating campsites or some kind of campsite that can plug into the system of piers and supports, and also just a complex environment on the pier with kayaking and people being able to look out at this complex space that people are going to explore.
All right, so with that said, let's turn our direction back to the design alternatives.
So back in this direction. This is one of the approaches that was mentioned briefly in the plans, and this could be considered a tactic as well that can be deployed anywhere. Here, this proposition is, where the pier is going to be inundated with time, it's going to be degraded. Certain concrete platforms are going to fall into the water. But it's this important cultural relic, so we want to maintain access. And what we're proposing is this matrix of pilings that create a three-dimensional sphere within which you can deploy all sorts of modules, both for people as well as habitat, cultural experiences. And the important thing is, you used to have this roughly 10-foot depth substrate here. But now with the flooding, but with the three-dimensional structure, this armature, you can create any depth that you want. And it's also just a great place to experiment with some of these and how well they would work.
And as Miles is describing this grid, part of our motivation in designing this was the idea of coming up with prototypical designs that could be redeployed at any site along the bay shoreline. And so a grid is, it's an infinitely adaptable thing. So with these units, the ecological units, the cultural units, just a few examples of how you can, of how they could be used at this site or at another site. These are various types of pathways. This is an example of a grid unit being used for eelgrass restoration. This is one that creates habitat for mussels or shellfish. And this is, you could link several squares together to create a performance space, or this could be used for a more glamping version, a more comfortable version of camping than what Joe proposed, or perhaps a picnic or taking in the sunset.
Directing, I'm going to locate you guys on the map. So Eric and I wanted to take on one of the landfills and really address that kind of head on as a unique feature of this site, but actually not that unique around the bay, really. So we looked, so we're just going to roughly describe the framework that we worked at and how that applies to Kiddo Parks. We looked at E as the landfill and D as the marsh extended. And really took it on. The pier is going to be our cultural center, and we have that strong spine. And from that strong spine, we're going to build out an economic force. Given that it's an economic force on top of a landfill, we wanted to address the landfill through a system of infrastructure that addresses the ecologies on the ground. Given the fact that sea level rise is going to inundate this full area by 2050, and again, that it sits on top of a landfill with a variety of contaminants. So we can't fully get into the kit of parts, but it both breaks down through a net matrix and builds up to a single small module of concrete, which we can proliferate across the site. But to get into the scheme.
Yeah, so the basic concept is if a site's already going to be inundated, does it make sense to come up with hundreds of trucks and pull out all that dirt and just replace it to have that inundation happen again? And so with this kind of compromised site, we wanted to imagine ways to pull on urbanization techniques from places like the Netherlands and look at a kind of floating urbanization that would allow for inundation and actually allow us to inundate in advance of the coming rising tides. So the move here is to encase the questionable site with armature of concrete or whatever. In the end, it's probably likely thinner than what I drew it at 1:30 in the morning. But this armature is the hinge then that would allow the creation of this anchored urbanization and also this system that we're proposing, which would be to flood that area and to begin leaching that water. So you can imagine this grid that Ray was talking about of perf pipe that's sitting underneath the substrate, and we have water coming down, and then that water is being moved back through the system to a sand filtration network. And we're talking about sand filtration because phytoremediation doesn't cut it when we talk about the sorts of gnarly heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and all the other things that are coming off of this site. So we can not only start to clean the leachate out of this site, but we can start to clean the fresh water supply as well. And what we wanted to convey with this image was a sense that we could have a very meaningful kind of urbanization that really says something about how we as humans can respond to the rising tide, which is to not sit behind the I-80, but to actually step across I-80 and say, this is our bay, this is the land that we've filled for better or for worse, and we're going to live on it for, into perpetuity. So,
very good. Thanks, Eric. So with that, we'll move it over back to Brian and Kevin for a summary, and then we can go from there.
All right, so we're going to, just a quick summary, and then we're going to just open it up for discussion. What struck Kevin and I as we looked across this amazing body of work, thank you everyone for this just immense mountain of work. The biggest challenge I think in the charrette, what made it extreme, was how to take all these amazing ingredients and make just a couple of dishes. We wish we could cook all day. What struck us was, in beginning with Christina's assignment, that the fundamental choice about human use versus not, and how as we turn those fundamental dials, many other dials turn with it. What struck me from looking at all this work is that there are certain sites, and I think this diagram really sums it up, they're going to have significant constraints that we must deal with. Some sites may be sacrificial, they could be flooded. Others we may choose to, we have to protect the entire thing. But there would be a lot of sites like this where we get to make multiple choices. Sometimes things are red and cannot be lost. Sometimes they're yellow and we can choose what to do with them. We think that's applicable to a lot of different sites. We think that that challenge, that problem is what gives this entire charrette just richness and depth. It's hard. What we love about the professional and the student work here is that they then took that armature, which we think applicable to every site, and they then built a spectrum. Whether it's something more about natural processes, where they're working with solutions that are more about dirt and grass and water, natural artifacts that are adaptable in case we're not right about sea level rise. We can accelerate them, we can decelerate them. Or whether or not we choose to invest significant infrastructure, tax-paying electorate, we really start to dump some investment into this, and we do that to preserve the cultural value or the program and enhance that. Maybe we actually amplify it. Maybe the rising tides actually bring us back to our coastal edge. And I think it all comes back to Christina's opening point, which is how we turn those fundamental dials about human use and occupancy is what was really explored throughout this charrette and what I find so rich.
That's great. Yeah, a few things have become really clear to me through this exercise, and one of them has to do with this scale right here of this level of investment, and the other has to do with the scale, which I think is about cultural and ecological value. And the thing that makes those so clear for me is that these two schemes address them. That scheme down there says that it is important to preserve and protect more parts of the site, and there's going to be a greater investment in order to do that. And in order to pay for that greater investment, we need to have a higher level of programming and revenue generating activities to support that, and so we have to look at a little bit more of an intensification in development. That deals with that scale. But it also then says that, well, some of those more constructed edges can run the risk of having a lower ecological value. So how do you compensate for that? And that's where the tactical approach, I think, has led to some really interesting solutions where they have shown that you can actually have a high ecological value when you're doing this much more constructed approach if you do it correctly. And then this scheme, I think, does it so differently and so beautifully that it says you can have a lower investment and a lower intensity of uses and a lower revenue possibilities. That's fine if the investment is lower. The ecological value is clearly elevated. That becomes very clear. And the question is then, what is the cultural, how do you get that elevated cultural value? And what is so nice about this scheme, I think, is that the sort of Zen beauty of the mound and the bowl and this long cultural pier, for me, makes it very easily imaginable that this is going to be an amazing place to go. And so I think it does attain that high cultural value and high ecological value. So I think that the fact that the design team stayed at these two ends of the spectrums, this kind of four-way chart, is really compelling. And I would love to hear comments from really guests and students. Brad, come on up here.
We know you're going to get in here.
You can't just take all these ideas without giving us some
notes. Would you like to go first? Well, gosh, I have to say I'm really impressed. I think it was a good idea to get these two out of your way before you carried on.
He's right.
But as I look around the room, there is so much food for thought here. For those of you who don't know, I work for a state agency with a regional jurisdiction that was created back in 1965 to prevent the bay from getting smaller due to unnecessary bay filling. And what we now know is we're an agency that's preparing for the bay to get bigger. And so how to deal with that is in some ways as expeditious as coming up with ideas like this overnight. But the reality is that it's going to take years and years and years to figure it out. It'll probably be a decade before we as a region figure out how we're going to grapple with the problem that you solved overnight. I have lots of notes here on this page, and I don't know where to begin. But here's a couple of thoughts. Following up on that, what I just said, here in the Bay Area, there's local home rule, right? We have local governments that control their own shorelines. We don't have regional government that decides what should happen down in the South Bay or in the East Bay or in Marin. So ideas that come out of, for a particular shoreline like the Berkeley shoreline, really have to come from, at least today, from the locals, until we have this sort of regional adaptation strategy that is developed with the help of many people. So think about that, and that goes for probably a lot of places around the nation and probably around the world. Think about where these ideas come from, who they're from. How do you move beyond a great idea that's on a wall to reality? Some of the other ideas have to do, that are on this page here, have to do with sort of a timeline, right? I'll take a simple idea, or simple topic, like interpretation, an educative piece, something that tells people, informs people about the issue. How do you place something in the water or on land that interprets sea level rise that won't happen for decades? What is that piece? Right? The idea of something, a piece of art living for 40 or 50 years and people looking and walking by it every day, that temporal piece has to be sorted out as you think through those. And this is in no order here. So jumping over to an idea about what happens if we do nothing. I think that this is one of the big pieces. How do we design for change, knowing that change happens over so much time? How do we keep from doing business as usual? We have projects coming in for permits all the time. And how do we sort of have people try new ideas? And those are some of the questions. This idea of doing nothing is sort of, in many ways, as Kevin said earlier, what we are doing. At BCDC, we've been working on this issue. Our first policies around this were from the 1980s, and for the last 5 years, as many of you know, we've been spending lots and lots of staff time working on it. We're doing a lot. But when developers get their permits, you look at the bottom line of the permit, you realize there's not much really that's different. And so I think that I hate to, this is where I'm trying not to wear my regulatory bureaucrat hat too much. I'm trying to be here, but I think that we need to start really, I'm really happy about this. I like the slogan out front, rise up, because really that is what we all need to do. We need to convince people that when they walk through the door, they should be thinking about doing things differently. They should be hiring consultants who are willing to take chances. They should be hiring coastal engineers who know what the issues are and want to try something new. And as Christina said earlier, the idea of incremental change is important. Trying small ideas out is going to be imperative to finding out whether they work. So if we screw up, we can undo what we did. We have no regrets about the decisions we make. There's lots more on here, but I'm going to let some other people talk, and then we'll come back.
I'd like to say something, if I can, about the choice to put housing out on that side. I'm not convinced by the analysis that's been done of that the cultural value of that pier is as much as you guys have made it to be. There may be some ecological value. There's some history. I live in a neighborhood that was a product of that key line, the train coming out. So the history of my place where I live is tied directly to that pier. So it's got some value. I question the real value of that as a cultural artifact. And I noticed that you haven't really addressed the freeway in these schemes. The freeway is something that we really need to retain. Whereas you've made a choice to add stuff out here to extend the city. A couple of, it's not a bad idea. I was part of a group that actually was promoting putting in 1.5 million square feet along the North Basin Strip to extend the city of Berkeley out to the waterfront. And the whole idea of an urban edge and the like. And the Santa Fe Railroad was originally proposed a development where you're showing your housing of 4 million square feet with a hotel and all this other stuff. The idea of bringing Berkeley people out to the waterfront was not of interest to the Berkeley people for housing and for retail and the like. But recreation is something that they truly wanted there. So I think there's just a fundamental question of why that. I mean, why that intensity of development? Not in terms of the cost, it's going to be enormously costly, but what is it really doing in the way in which we relate to the Bay? Whereas if you left it to its own devices, it would find its own way of reestablishing nature. And there's no reason you can't get very intensive uses in this kind of a scheme, I don't think. So the question of development is really one of how do you define development? Is it large concrete structures, huge infrastructure investments, or is it thinking creatively about the way people can actually get out and make use of this space? It's a very different equation. If you're going to look at cultural artifacts that really need to be preserved, if the kit of parts says, what do we really need to preserve as part of our cultural heritage, I'm not sure there's that much out there that's worth preserving. That's my own personal opinion. And whereas the freeway is something we really need to maintain. And so, that's...
I think there's a couple really interesting points in there. I mean, first of all, I would say I think the idea of new development out there, whether it's housing or something else, is kind of just an asterisk on the plan that says something that's going to generate money to pay for the higher level of investment, whether it's housing or if you can make a lot of money on recreation, enough money to warrant that investment to protect that marina and other places, then maybe that's a better use. So I would leave it at that, whether it's housing or something else. And I would say that, to me, the pier is really an excellent example of something that I agree doesn't have a high enough cultural value right now, like many things around artifacts around the Bay, and that's really sort of too bad. What we ought to do is amplify its cultural value so it does have more, so that more people come to the waterfront, because what we really need is for more people to get down on the waterfront and value the waterfront more and increase its importance in all of our own minds and our identity of the Bay Area. Then there'll be much more incentive to do something. I think the reason why nothing is happening is because we have all these really fairly marginal assets around the Bay Area that just are not being capitalized on.
So I'm going to follow up on that if I can. One of the things I wrote down here was someone had said make liabilities opportunities, and I think that I really believe in that. I think that's really important. But we have to remember that here in the Bay Area, the 9-county Bay Area, there's getting on 8 million people or something, there's such pressure to take our land uses and drag them down into the San Francisco Bay that we have to keep reminding ourselves that that might not always be the best thing. It's easy to draw up pictures that do just that. And it will be very tempting to do as the water gets higher, we try to solve some of these problems. And in some cases, it may very well be the right idea. But we should always be aware that we are doing that. We're taking there right now. There is an urban growth boundary, and it's called mean high tide. And once we start pulling things over that shoreline, we're changing. Now, someone said, as the gentleman in the back said, this is our bay, and we're going to live on it. Well, I think that kind of sums it up to a lot of people. Really, to a lot of people, I think what I'm getting at is that when we change, and we will, there has to be multiple benefits. Every project that we do, every regional idea that we come up with has to have multiple benefits to this strategy. And the last thing I'll say is that it's going to take a lot of money to make these changes, and so we have to have these creative financing systems, whether it's in development, private development, probably in many places will help pay for that. There probably won't be enough public money to go around and do all the things that we would like to do. But at the end, we are envisioning a new Bay Area. right? We're envisioning a new shoreline edge, and that's why it's so exciting to see these ideas on this wall, because they are continuing this conversation to bring it to a whole new level about what the future of the Bay Area will be.
So I wanted to talk a little, first of all, I thought this was great, and we work a lot on the shoreline and sea level rise, and it's great to see so many new ideas. I wanted to talk a little bit about the cultural pier, and just to kind of encourage us to look back a little bit farther. I saw you have the Coast Survey map up there before the pier, and so what we do at SFEI is reconstruct historic landscapes and really think about the ecological function of that specific place before European modification. And what's really cool about that area is that there were these little sort of really weathered sandstone outcroppings, Fleming's Point and Brooks Island, that were this kind of a stopping. So behind that, coming down from the alluvial fan of Berkeley, were wetlands. And so part of this landscape was actually a rock that had wetlands separating it from the mainland, which was this slow grading alluvial fan with Strawberry Creek coming out. And what's interesting to think about now is that Aquatic Park, which is just south of where you guys are working, is essentially the stormwater collector for Berkeley. And it seems like sort of a great opportunity to kind of go through Highway 80, reconnect Aquatic Park to something along the bay, and sort of, you're not trying to put creeks back where they were, put wetlands back where they were, but you're trying to kind of replicate those ecological functions and physical processes that were there that allow for, that are underlying this landscape still. And while we've modified it a lot, we've changed things irrevocably. We haven't changed like the geology and the underlying geomorphic processes and sort of sediment delivery to the bay. In fact, we've modified them, but a lot of those features are still there. And so that was making me think about the great idea that a lot of people have been talking about for years, and that we just had this great workshop that Liz put on about the horizontal levee. And really what that's about is connecting the intertidal habitat to the upland ecotone, as you guys know, but that it's really not just about the shoreline, it's about how the shoreline connects to the uplands and how the watersheds are connected. And so crossing 80 seems like a really important thing to at least consider, because the shoreline is a function, as you know, of many physical processes. It's the tides and the wave energy and the ocean. But it's also about the watershed and sort of what that brings. And so just kind of connecting those is really important to think about.
So I'm an ecologist, and so one thing I just want to bring up that you guys pointed out, the Central Bay is very much armored. So I wasn't a big fan of building on one of the few places that doesn't have infrastructure on top of it, the buildings there. Thinking that the Central Bay may actually be a place that we end up having to abandon as a place that we can actually have natural shoreline, because we are built right up to the edge, just about every place along that shoreline. And the Berkeley Marina area, actually, or that whole, whatever you want to call that whole area that you guys are talking about, has some potential actually to try to create more habitat and to keep us off shoreline. So that's one point. The second point is, as someone who's doing restoration in the Bay right now, and we just put in a project that we're calling a Living Shorelines project, where we put in oyster reef, oyster shells to attract native oysters, and we're putting in eelgrass beds. And we're looking at both the habitat value of these on a larger scale than what has been done in the Bay before, but also trying to start to think about how these kind of natural structures can be used to protect shorelines. It is very hard to move forward with anything like this. When you think about what can you do here that you can apply to other places in the Bay, you have to, for one thing, think about who owns those parcels of the Bay. I don't know if people realize that the Bay is owned, privately owned, publicly owned, all throughout. When I get ready to do an eelgrass restoration project, I not only have to figure out where it makes sense to do that, but who owns that, and will they let me do it there? And can I get a permit to do it there? Because that person is going to have to sign that permit along with me, right? So I love these ideas that you guys are coming up with, and I am fascinated by the idea of these floating eelgrass beds and that sort of thing. I got to think about the ecology of that and whether I can get my, can get around that. But I like it. I'm willing to go there because I think there can be habitat value there when you think about the uses of eelgrass beds and oyster reefs. That's fish habitat, that's invertebrate habitat, and you could have that raised up off the bay bottom. So I'm willing to go there for sure.
Brad, can we just approve that permit?
She's a member of the Monitoring Club.
Yeah, the fill would be small. That would be way down in the, so floating fill. But just thinking about, these are really big ideas that you guys have, and we need those big ideas, and we're going to have to be able to have the money to do it, as you've identified, but we're also going to have the planning in place to do it soon. And we're not doing really anything right now, so we can't wait 50 years and then say, okay, boom, let's put this stuff in. We got to really start moving forward with, what do we want to do? Do we have the public support? Where do we get the money? How do we get the permits? And start making some forward moves. So I'm excited to hear you guys being so inspired.
First of all, I just love the ideas, and I really think the work you guys have done has really been fantastic for a couple of days' work. It actually reminds me of Charles Eames. I don't know if you know the power of 10, moving from micro to macro. This reminds me a lot of that. And the answer for the Bay, as Brad was referring to and others, is not going to be solved either at the micro level or at the macro level. It's really going to need ideas and thinking of exactly what's going on here, moving between micro and macro, and actions of both. But two things that struck me, I love the fact that you were starting to think about the economic framework. How could you make this happen? And over here, risk management. If you do nothing, you've still got to do something. So the answer cannot be you can't do anything. And so I think what would be really exciting, and maybe Brad could take this on. And in the scheme of how do you move this forward at a macro scale for the Bay? Because we are in a position of retreat from the Bay, and we are in a position of really having to think where you want human activity to be, where you want urban density to be, and where you don't want it to be. And it's a very complex set of conditions. And I just would love to, imagine the day where there is a BCDC regional agency somehow integrated with a regional redevelopment agency, where the complexity of all of this, land ownership between cities and strategy needed to sort of develop a regional framework and an economic redevelopment framework, because a lot of this is going to rely on parcel by parcel strategy, on changing ownership to allow retreat to happen, to allow these beautiful ideas for restoration to happen at parts along the Bay where that can occur. I think it's very difficult to actually look at one specific site in the Bay without that macro context, because you haven't got a framework to make decisions. Building out there would probably be 5 times or more the cost of developing on land that was not over landfill. So then, if that was really the way to go and there was compelling rationale to do that, you'd want to have that backed up by a compelling rationale for why that should be there and not in 50 other locations around the Bay. So I think this has been very thought-provoking work today. It's really great to see.
I think the thing I appreciate the most is the extremes, which is absolutely appropriate to go to the extreme of the floating housing over here from the extreme of not doing anything. To me, an important question is, so how do you find what's the sort of values that would drive the decisions between those extremes? And I think the reality of the financial to support public spaces that Kevin brings up is really important. On the other hand, I'm, like a lot of people, though I'm glad you did it, uncomfortable with the idea of housing out there. And the reason is, I think the Bay deserves as many civic uses. Some of those civic uses may be private, may be privately owned. And I'm not someone that thinks, oh, you do not build on the bay, take it all back to eelgrass or whatever. But I do think when it is built, that it's something we all have the right to get to the edge to. And I've never worked on the bay, but I have worked on another wonderful coast in the east, in North Carolina, where many of these same issues come up that have to do with private and public access. As was pointed out, there's already a lot of privately owned bay edge. And so I think whatever is used to finance the public use, and there's a lot of desire for public use, public recreational use out in that whole area, that the driving value of how much you do and how much you don't, where you strike your balance between here and there, should be driven by a value of public access along every corner of that Berkeley. For Berkeley to go and cut off public access to something that has public access now, I think concerns me. But I also think it sets how you make these decisions, the priorities for making decisions. And so that's the value of this. I mean, you guys really did a great job. If you hadn't done the housing over there, this conversation wouldn't have happened in the way that it did.
To be clear, you would be able to walk around this housing.
But I tell that to the average American. It's also in you think about all of the areas that are brownfields or contaminated sites are on the bay because of a history of military uses and a history of municipal landfilling. And how will we pay to either protect or clean up or remove those places, or will we allow them to leak into the nearshore environment? I certainly hope not the latter. But I can only imagine that we'll have to pay for that through some kind of development. And where will that development occur? Maybe just vertical development. But we have to plan for that soon, because those will be some of the places least well funded to protect. There's no one interested in protecting them except people who don't want them to do something. We need a positive, something that does want something.
And actually, that part, I think one of the most fascinating things, if it's possible, that should be looked at, is the idea of sealing off these places, the ones that are really contaminated, and just putting something on top of it.
To the extent that we can, to the extent that really works.
To the extent that it works. If it works, I mean, I have no idea. But it's an interesting idea.
Maintaining that wall. Is Chris here? Chris Dunn, was he just walked out?
I wanted to just say one other thing that struck me as we were talking about these various things. The tsunami and earthquake and tsunami in Japan inundated this area in the north coast of the main island. Matsushima Bay is one of the great sites in Japan. It's a bay right next to where the earthquake happened, and it's got a series of islands out, in sort of iconic islands. The town right there was protected from the tsunami. It's one of the only places along the coast that wasn't inundated. These schemes that are suggesting that there would be a barrier outside on the outer edge to protect the land on the inside, I think actually carry a lot of weight for protecting the inland areas. And if they're ecologically based or urban based, I don't think that really much matters, as long as we're thinking about these as sort of a first layer of defense in combination with the marshes and the like. So there's another aspect to this, which is getting outside of the limit of the project and thinking about what these are doing to protect the rest of the place. And that's a model, I think, throughout the whole bay. There are these things are offshore. Every city has a landfill.
Absolutely. Just to riff with that, just briefly, I think that really strikes back and connects back to this diagram, which we only spent a second on, but it also connects to previous land use and those outcrops of stone and what this land was. Historically, anything in the Central Bay receives the brunt of the environmental, erosion and wind and all of that. So, like you said, these sites could do a lot of things for human use, ecology, but one thing they certainly do is help buffer and protect further inland zones. What we thought was interesting here was that historically there weren't a lot of wetlands here, which make a lot of sense, just relative to the sort of dumbbell of the South and the North Bay, because it gets so much environmental hit. What we did see a lot of in history was there were some wetlands, and there were also a lot of beaches that protected those wetlands. A lot of beach. And that makes sense with sand deposits. So what I find interesting about the two schemes' response to that then is, are there artifacts, whether they're landfills or whether they're piers that help defend the land and those inward communities? And then how do those fixed objects then create other opportunities? So here the idea that sand would swirl around and create a wetland and a beach, or over there that we actually create a series of structures that give us some armature for creating ecology that really adapt to that. I start to see, I think, what Brad was looking for a larger strategy for addressing the bay that really kind of starts with that dumbbell and the environmental effects, builds on what was there before. And then after that, what these two schemes do above all else, it's sort of like the heat under the sauce. How hot do we turn it up, towards human use or not? Sounds like we may have overcooked with housing. Maybe we could have stayed with soccer, like we were thinking before. And then you might also ask, well, what else could we program this site with to increase some more cultural value in human use? So just turning that heat up or down, I think, is the fundamental challenge. But maybe we kind of start here.
Although I think we are going to have to move more towards generating private money for this, because as sea level rises around the country and around the world, and we're all looking for money at the same time for adaptation, there will be no centralized money available unless we really tax ourselves a lot, and you know how popular that is. So either there's going to be a massive popular shift in terms of funding from taxation, or there's going to be more development. Or we're just going to try to let it go and then suffer the consequences.
That's good.
Richard, do you want to offer some closing thoughts? Well, my closing thoughts is wow. The body of work here is unbelievable, and the amount of ideas generated is probably the richest that we've ever had in any of our Xtreme experiences. How was the experience for you guys? Did you like it? I think it was
super extreme.
It is extreme. We kept looking to see if you were having fun, but it's hard to tell all those. But thank you so much for taking part in this. I hope that you met new people and you have those friendships for a long, long time. So thanks for all the design participants. Thanks, Luann, for making all the arrangements and making us a little bit comfortable. Thanks our co-host, Landscape Architecture Foundation, Barbara, is here, right? And to our incredible team leaders. So we have a gift for the two team leaders. Kevin, thanks so much. All right, thanks. I feel like I have 40 new friends, so thank all of you. And of course, none of this would have been possible without Christina. So. Have a trip home.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say, none of this would have been possible without Landscape Form. So not only did they make beautiful, wonderful products that help create the type of places that we all dream of and make, but they also have this culture of philanthropy and commitment to the profession to invest in it with events like this and many other things you see through the foundation, through ASLA and other activities. So we thank you so much for making this possible.
Thanks to all our guests who took time out of their workday to come over and hear these ideas that developed overnight.
You can see the videotape of the presentation. We'll try and make that available via Dropbox or something to get back to everybody. All right? Thanks.
How about you? group photo. Brian, all right. Everyone over.
Not too tall, so
Chummy.
Show some love. Brad and Beverly have you. Wow, you guys are quiet. All right, as my little daughter would say cheese. Cheese.
street furniture.
There you go.